Merete, it's an honor to have you here, and I've been thoroughly enjoying the beauty of the people,
Thank you
oil
so
on
much.
canvas. It's so beautifully written, and I look forward to, let's say, alternating between Danish and English. I will wait for
Yes.
you to kind of give me the cue on what to read and when to stop.
Yes.
And I'm really excited to see how this goes. And
Yeah.
uh,
But I think I will also, because I will read a little less in Danish, as people probably don't really understand anything.
I
But I
mean,
will
yeah.
also just give an introduction to the context of the book.
Yes, please.
So it's I have a family background coming from a very poor countryside in Denmark in the 1930s, and my mother grew up in an extremely poor family. They didn't have enough to eat. They worked very hard to put food on the table, and during the war, there was a severe lack of everything. My mother has a small brain damage for not having enough fats in her childhood. And they had she had electricity when she was 12 years old. That was in 1943. And many people believe that Denmark is different, and it is also different, but there are places of the country that was like this. And at 14, she was sent out to work, sent away from her family, because they could, you would not feed a child after it was 14 years of age. You were sent out to work. And she worked very hard, and the poverty was not only material or in nutrition, it was also in the way people treated each other. And so when I became an adult and I became a writer and I have been to university, I realized that many of the stories I told about my family, people thought, wow, is this really true? And I wanted to write a book about it. But it took me some time to find the right form, because somehow I wanted it to be true. And then I realized one day that I was telling a story about my mother who had been milking. And she said, no, I never milked a cow. And oh, you told me she keeps repeating the same stories. I said, yeah, you told me that story so many times. And said, no, I never milked a cow. And I realized that the truth about the past becomes fiction. I'm still sure she milked, and she's still sure she didn't. And the truth is somewhere in between. And maybe I remember a story my aunt told instead, or maybe there are things she doesn't want to remember, some of the really hard and harsh things that like disappears. And the island is a small island my family comes from, and people are always telling stories. It's a storytelling island, and everybody has names. They give each other funny names, and also I think that even the true stories, they grow into fiction being told many times at parties and dinners. So that gave me an immense sense of freedom, because I thought, okay, the truth has disappeared in time. What I can grasp is the core of the truth, and I can bring my own language, and I can bring my imagination, and write this story that has, for many Danish people, become true on a higher level, because the journey my parents undertook, coming from this really poor agricultural background, working hard at factories, while my father took an education, and then he got educated as an engineer and started working, and my mother then stopped working and had children, and they moved to the suburb and had a materially more pleasant life, but they were still very, yes, I would say traumatized by their childhood. They had many problems carrying with them. And that journey was undertook by, I think, the majority of the Danish population, and I think also it's what's going on like in India now, the same journey where people move from the countryside into the cities and they need to work really hard. And the biggest wish in life is that the children get a higher education. And that, I think, it's so common for so many people, with the dreams you have, the longings, and also the problems. And also that then what happens is that when the children get a higher education, like my sister became a doctor, and I was supposed to become an engineer, but I'm really bad at math, and I became a writer instead. But I did get a higher education, and that removed us really far from our parents. So they, I have felt that there's like a huge sorrow in the connection between the parents who wish for their children to get this higher education, but when they get it, they lose them, because you change politically, you change in your way of life, maybe the traditional values, you don't have them in the same way as your parents. So there's like, it's like no matter what you do, it's difficult. Like my mother, she had met a childhood friend of mine, and she had become a hairdresser, and she was like, oh, what if you had become a hairdresser? And I could feel in her voice the longing for me to become someone she could understand and be closer to, and who would maybe have the same values as her. But at the same time, if I had become a hairdresser, she would have been extremely disappointed. Right. So it's like, it's so difficult. And that is the background of the book. So the book tells us, it is a fiction. My mother's name is not Marie, and my family in real life is much larger than the family in the book, which is still large, but it was really big. And of course, I work with the narrative. I make it into a story that is somehow larger than real life, for more people to be able to follow that journey they have from the countryside to the suburbs, and identify with it, and maybe, which is my hope, to understand something, to understand all this. So also what I'm interested in is the mental journey when history changes, when life changes, historically, like they were children. The book starts before the Second World War, and of course they're very affected by the World War, and it ends up in a relatively stable life in the 70s, but a life with lots of freedom. The 68 generation came, and these people were raised under very hard authority. The mother and father would beat them, the teacher would beat them, the priest would beat them. But when they became adults and maybe thought, oh, now I will be the authority, the whole generation came and said, no, we don't believe in authorities. And so what I'm interested in is the individual mind in these historical changes. How do we do it? For somebody it's easy, for somebody it's really difficult. And you need to change your mind. It's a mental journey.
I think I found that very interesting, that the point of view, the main point of view of the narrative is a child. It's from her perspective, and I think that really clarifies that trajectory of witnessing violence, being at the receiving end of it, and how generational trauma kind of manifests itself in different people differently, right? I think let's get into reading it, and then we have another hour to talk about the various which will be just as exciting. So over to you, Merete. Please let me know when you'd like me to read and what.
Yes.
English.
So
Merete will be reading in Danish, and I will read in English for our audience. All right.
And don't worry, I won't read 1 hour in Danish, but I will read 15 sentences, I think, so you can hear the rhythm of the language. I work very much with the rhythm, and I hope you can hear that. Marie sad i græsset og stirrede på de røde ribs på busken, som vinden skurede frem og tilbage over den hvidkalkede mur. Hun vidste, at hun ville få slag, hvis hun plukkede ribsene, og forestillede sig smagen af et surt, rødt bær, som en bitter sol i munden, over for en hård, skarp smerte på kinden. Det var lige ved, at den røde mundfulde ribs var stærkest. Marie gled frem på knæene, græsstråene føjede sig under hendes ben, og hun strakte 2 fingre frem mod ribsene. I samme øjeblik skete der 2 ting, som om hendes fingre i luften hev i 2 usynlige snore. Marie, Marie. Yeah, I think that's a good. Yeah, you can read more, of course. Yeah. Sorry.
Marie sat in the grass, staring at the red currant berries on the bush, and the wind scoured back and forth across the whitewashed wall. She knew that if she picked them, her face would be smacked, and she imagined the taste of a tart berry, red berry like a bitter sun in her mouth against a hard, sharp sting on her cheek. The red berry mouthful was almost the stronger. Mary slid onto her knees, the stalks of grass folding under her legs, her fingertips just reaching for the berries, when 2 things happened at once, as if her 2 fingers in the air had tugged 2 invisible strings. Marie, Marie, 1 in a particularly harsh tone, the voice of her mother. 2, a warm sensation on the back of her hand. Marie looked down and saw a chalky smear of seagull shit on her skin. Her head shot up, but the bird was gone. Her mother's voice again, sharper this time. Marie, Marie. Shall I go on? Marie rose, wiped her hand in her checkered apron, and ran into the kitchen where the voice usually came from. But there was only the black, stinking stove burning. The head of a pig lay on the hob, and Valdemar was on the bunk at the kitchen table, head down, writing bees without looking up. Marie passing through the door to the stairwell leading up to the 2 rooms where they slept, and there sat her mother, the skirt of her checked cotton dress flowing down the stairs. Marie's apron was sewed up from a scrap of cloth from that same dress. Marie's mother had her 5-year-old brother, Kash. Am I saying that right?
No, he's Kai, or K.
Kai, K, yeah. Okay. K on her lap, one of her hands stuffed deep down his throat. What has he done? Asked Marie. The wasp, screamed the mother, those God-forsaken wasps. Marie saw a blue tone creeping into her brother's ruddy face, which was already twisted askew. Her mother removed her hand from his throat and touched her lips to his, trying to breathe some air into his lungs instead, but no difference came to the color of his face. Marie spun on her heel, dashed to the kitchen, back into the garden as fast as she could. But you have to help me, screamed her mother. Marie sprinted across the damp, pliable grass to the whitewashed fence where the thicket of reeds grew. Kai usually picked them to tickle her, making the garden feel even closer to the shore of Langland Sound that it already was. But now she broke off a stalk, put it in her mouth, and charged back over the grass, chewing one end flat as she ran back through the kitchen door, past the searing pot on the hearth, the pig's head, grinning at her, and Valdemar, who had wet his pants standing by the kitchen table. Kai's face was purple now, and her mother's white lips were firmly pressed to his mouth. Move, said Marie, even though she knew the children were to be seen, not heard. She shoved her mother's mouth from Kai's. Her mother's eyes shone deeper green. They were glistening beads of glass as her face slid away. Marie plunged the reed into the soft flesh of Kai's throat. Putting her mouth to the other end, she had to stand on her toes, for the stalk was long, producing a faint whistle like some strange bird call underground. As Marie forced air down her brother's throat, past the wasp sting into his lungs, oxygen flowed into his veins, and breathing regularly as she blew, mother and sister saw the same. Briefly, a darkening purple, which washed into blue, then red, slowly revealing Kai's own cream freckle face with red blotches.
That was really nice. Thank you so much. Thank you. Yeah, so this is the opening scene where Marie saves her brother's life. Yeah.
It's so, I mean, there was a lot of trepidation in the very beginning. And it, I think it began with a very leisurely pace, like she's sitting on the grass as if life's pretty good, and then there's a sudden crisis which she's very quick to solve. I think it already says a lot about Marie in the very beginning, right? That she's a problem solver, she's good in crisis, and good in leading, in taking control when needed, even though she's a child.
Yeah.
I think I really enjoyed the, I mean, you know, the red currant berries, the tastes, the different flavors in it, a very sensory experience. And also the introduction to the other brother, who's something of a silent figure, but also perhaps a lot younger, a little scared because he's wet his pants at the sight of a crisis. Shall we move on and read some more?
So I think I would like us to maybe to jump a little ahead. I guess you have you have also the whole chapter where the father comes home.
I have the entire, yeah, I do, yeah.
Sorry, I need to, it's teasing me because it doesn't want to move on the page. Okay, here I got it. So the father, he comes home from work, and something strange has happened, because he has something with him. He has a painting with him. So, I mean, we don't necessarily have to read the same page, but I'll just read a little about when he opens the package he's carrying home. Folkets skønhed, sagde faren og begyndte at pakke pakken ud. Det her har de skide bønder sgu ikke forstand på. De kan ikke andet end at æde. Vi kan sagtens klare os med kartofler i en uge. Ikke også, unger? Marie gik hen ved siden af sin mor. Valdemar så forsigtigt op og nikkede. Jeg kan godt lide kartofler, mumlede han. Faren rakte en hånd frem og klappede ham på kinden, så lagde han billedet på bordet. Yeah. So
perhaps I'll start with, what did you bring home with you? Asked her mother. Between them, Marie and her mother only had 5 potatoes left to peel. This is after dinner. The scorching hot potatoes burned her fingertips. Look forward to it after dinner, Carl said. Marie's mother looked up at her husband in surprise. Marie put the last potato on the serving dish. Her mother pinched the chopped dill in her fingers and sprinkled it over the potatoes. As Marie opened the door to the pantry, the smell of fat and vinegar clamored in her nostrils. She found the butter dish on the shelf and brought it to the table. When everyone was seated, the family folded their hands in prayer. 5 heads bowed to their fingertips. Their mother said grace. When she was done, they raised their heads as one. Her father cut the cheeks off the pig's head and put them on his plate. Using the point of his carving knife, he pried the skull open, cut a slice off the brain and laid it between the cheeks. Then he handed the knife to Marie's mother. She pushed the bowl of potatoes, steaming dill within his reach. Potatoes, yes, he said, the corners of his mouth curling into a smile. Staving the pig's skull, Marie's mother cut slices of brain for herself and her children. Carl chomped on his meat and potatoes while his children ate silently, as if their mouths were made of cloth. Their father pushed his plate away, wiped his fingers on the tablecloth, and clapped their mother on the shoulder as he rose from the table. Then he picked up the square bundle he had brought with him, sat down with it in his lap, and glanced at their mother. Martha, we are not going to live like those common farmers, he said. They think they are better than us just because they have land. But we have something they will never understand. We have the beauty of the people. Marie's mother pushed her plate away, folded her hands before her, and nodded. The beauty of the people, he repeated. Her father opened the sideboard drawer, took out the membership card of the Social Democratic Party, and laid it on the table between them. Do you remember Hans? He asked his wife. She nodded. Clear the table, Marie. Marie stood up immediately, carried the plates and cutlery to the basin, and brought the remains of the pig's head into the pantry. Carefully draping the fly net over the leftovers, she listened to her father, who was talking to her mother in a tone she seldom heard. Kai and Waldemar remained seated at the table, dead silent, in the hope of not attracting attention to themselves. He went to Holland, said Martha. With that, madam, she added. Nothing came of it then? Well, Hans is back in Langland and flat broke, said her father. He asked if I needed an apprentice. I told him, I don't throw crumbs to the birds before I've had my own fill. Then he asked if I wanted to buy a painting. He said he got it from the madam to make him disappear as fast as possible. He wanted 5 kroner for it. Martha gaped at her husband. Please tell me you didn't give him the money. The beauty of the people, said Carl, starting to unwrap the bundle. Something the stupid farmers will never be able to appreciate. All they can do is stuff their faces. We are quite capable of surviving on potatoes for a week. Isn't that right, children? Marie went to her mother's side, looking up cautiously. Waldemar nodded. I like potatoes, he mumbled. Carl reached out and patted his son's cheek. Then he laid the painting down on the table before his family. The painting was about 2 hand breadths wide, 1 high. Most of the colors were dark. 2 women, dressed in long black habits like the one that Marie's mother wore, were pictured from behind, bending over their work in a copper-brown field. But between them, a woven basket with handles was filled with shiny round potatoes. Some had missed the basket and lay on the glistening clay soil beside them. Behind the women, a hazy green hedgerow, perhaps a fence, and some tall, slender flower stalks. 2 prune trees leaned toward the women as if to kiss them. A low afternoon sun slanted through the trees' naked branches, lighting up the women's bonnets. Up above it all, a pale gray sky, which Marie knew so well from Langland. In the bottom right corner, a name in a clumsy scrawl, Vincent. Marie put her finger on the spot where the light shot through the branches. The sun, she said simply. We cannot possibly have it hanging in the house, said Martha. It's indecent. It cannot be indecent to dig up potatoes, said Carl. You also stick up your rump in the air when you dig potatoes. But he could have painted them from the other side, insisted his wife, her lips tightly pursed. But then we wouldn't have seen the sun, said Marie, touching the spot again. The sun was 2 slim strokes of white, 1 thick stroke of golden yellow. She felt the thick paint press against her fingertip, traced over the woman lightly, down into the right corner.
Thank you so much. So I would like to put some comments on this part of the book. So there are 2 things in it. So the one is the potatoes. And I grew up, we had potatoes every day when I grew up. And I had to learn to peel them. And I'm very clumsy. So it was difficult because, you know, my father would come home at 5 o'clock from work. And the potatoes had to be on the table, peeled, and still hot. So they needed to be very hot when we peeled them. And I was allowed to have a small, like a cake thing to hold them with. So because you were not allowed to make holes in them. They had to be perfect rounded. And the thing is, my father wouldn't have cared. I mean, if I had put a whole fork, he wouldn't have cared. But my mother was very proud about our potatoes. It was a big thing. It was a big identity thing somehow. And I had an aunt who was from another island in Denmark, and she would peel the potatoes before she boiled them, which was horrific. according to my mother. And she really never became part of the family because she treated the potatoes in a different manner. So it was really, really important. I have some friends in Italy, and one of them is married to a Dane, and they just make so much fun that Danes know like 22 different kinds of potatoes. You know, so it's an identity mark for us. And then this painting, because it is a painting of Vincent van Gogh. So it's like a tragic trade going through the book, that they are so poor and they have this painting that's actually will be worth billions of dollars later, and they don't know it, and they just think it's indecent. And when the grandmother comes to help with, every time a baby is born, she's coming to help, and she finds it so indecent because these women are seen from the behind, that they put the painting out in the stable when she comes. But one of the reasons that I use this painting is that I worked a lot with Vincent van Gogh. I did a large essay on his letters when they were published, I think 15 years ago, and I read them all. Really interesting reading his letters. And when he was not that young, but he had a longer relationship with one woman, and she was a prostitute. He found her on the street where she was going around trying to make money, and she was pregnant and still trying to make money as a prostitute. And so he took her in, and they lived together. And her family stopped it because they were not sure that he had the right ideas, which he had. It's a big tragedy, in fact, that the family interfered. But I had an aunt who was my favorite aunt because she was different than all the other women who were quite, farmer women. And she was very elegant, and she would drink tea instead of coffee. And she was tall and slender, and she had married my very small sailor uncle. And she was extremely generous. She didn't have children herself, so she gave me and my sister huge chocolate eggs for Easter, and she was always giving us lots of presents and chocolates. And then I understood people said about her, oh, well, she has always been too generous in her life. That was what they said about her. And I thought it had to do with all the chocolate we got. But when I grew up, I realized it was because when they met, she had been a prostitute on one of the harbors in Denmark. And she had died before I understood that. So I never got to know anything really about her life. And I cared so much about her. So it was really strange that I couldn't, get to know that part of her life. And also my grandmother, she was like ruling this little town. She was, the great matron of the city, and she could have ruined this marriage if she had wanted, but she didn't. She said, no, she was just too generous. So this link, there's like this link between my family and Vincent van Gogh's story that is, of course, not one-to-one, but for me, working as a writer, it gives me a lot of, energy. It energizes the writing motor with these stories being connected, and try to understand also all these different people have these different choices to make, and that sometimes you make a choice you really don't want to make, but maybe it's the only choice you have.
Yeah.
Or even worse. So that's another reason why they have this this Van Gogh painting, and it is called the beauty of. They call the painting the beauty of the people, but of course there's also a bit a bitter sense, like with the barriers, a bitter sense of this beauty, because it is not very beautiful, their lives, but they keep seeking beauty. The only thing, I mean, at this time they don't have, of course, they don't have radio, they don't even have electricity, so they have no entertainment, they have no, their visual life is very limited, and it's limited to the church also. And the Danish church is Protestant, and it's very bare. It's not, if you go to church, the walls will be white, there will be very little to see. What you can see in these churches on the islands where so many men are fishermen or sailors is boats that the fishermen make like a kind of sacrifice before they go. So you have beautiful model ships hanging in the churches, but the language is extremely rich. So you have the Bible, everybody could recite the Bible, and the old translations of the Bible where the language is kept, it's mystic, it's strange words, strange things. So there's a huge beauty in that, and also in the Psalms they will sing. So for me as a writer, it's really interesting that one of the few aesthetic pleasures they had at the time, except for the nature, of course, is language, and the religious language, and what is also part of the book is
the hymn that Marie really despises. There's one bit
yeah,
there,
she
right?
hates the one where I hate
yeah.
you. You know, it's talking about, you know, the bird sings in the morning and is dead in the evening, and the children plays in the morning and they are dead in the evening. And of course, many children died at that time. But so what I also try to describe is what we call popular belief. So you had the church who was really strict. It's a strict church. It's not fun. And there are many rules, and things has to be thought of in a very particular way, and the priest will make sure that the people think as the dogma says. But underneath that, there's a whole populistic belief, which is against the church. So like in the Protestant church, you don't do sacrifices. I mean, it's not a thing. So when I say that about the ships, that's not how it's supposed to be considered, but that's how it works. And they have this saying about the ocean, that the ocean takes and the ocean gives.
Just like the Lord giveth and the Lord taketh, but replaced with the ocean. And I think there's a mention that the women mutter it under their breath instead of saying it out loud, so that the pastor doesn't catch them.
Yeah. And there's also another huge thing in the book, because so they believe that if somebody is not baptized, you will go to hell. And she gives birth to a stillborn child, and the priest says, as is part of the dogma, that he cannot baptize the child because it's dead at birth. And so the church will think, well, when you're not born yet, there is still no heaven or hell. But the family doesn't understand that. They think this baby is going to hell because you won't baptize her. And so it's a huge tragedy. And I wrote it because one of my friends, who's really, she's very religious, and she was in this, and she's my age, and you know, she was in despair when they didn't want to baptize her stillborn child. And she found a vicar who would do it. Because it was so important. And after the book came out, I held a speech about the book, a lecture about the book at a religious convent with all the bishops in Denmark and 300 vicars. And I read this part, and I said, yeah, you know, I know that some do it even though it's not allowed. And you should have heard the row after. It was like 300 vicars and bishops just starting to discussing this, and who would do it and who wouldn't do it. And so it's a big it's a big issue that I tried to. When I put it in the book, I didn't know it was such a big issue because the dogma is just there. So the bishop thinks there's no discussion. You cannot baptize a stillborn child, but still some do it for the family, you know, out of misericordia, out of charity, out of compassion with the family. So it's a way also of showing, you know, the people, what we call the people, and the authorities, and how it sometimes goes against each other. Yeah.
Can we talk about the fire in the book, right? That bit where they go to see where the fire had, I mean, that's one of the last bits that I could manage to read in the last couple of days. Should we read that bit, or do you have something else in mind?
No, I think it's really perfect.
I love that line, summer came as a sigh through the rain. I highlighted it. It's so beautiful.
Thank you. Yeah, just find it here.
When Marie wakes up to pee, right? Basically, isn't that the
night? I think I got a little too far here. I'm sorry. Yeah. Som viste sig i træers blade, slog smut på havoverfladen, fik kutterne til at ligne dovne havfugle, og Maries mor til svulme op i benene og hænderne. Marie måtte skure gulvene og bælge ærter og plukke ribs, men det var på tide, at hun begyndte at hjælpe til. Det var vel også derfor, de kun gik i skole hver anden dag. Ja.
I have to pee, said Marie. Is that okay? To start with. Run up the road when you're done, said the mother. Go see if there's fire anywhere. Marie nodded and slipped out the door. Her bare feet scampered the 5 steps over the muddy path and hurried the remaining 7 over the wet grass that brought her to the privy. The candle flame had died, and she left the door open as she emptied her bladder as quickly as possible. Done, she dashed back to the path, opened the gate, and ran up the gravel road. The trees whooshed like massive dark bassoons overhead. From the top of the rise, she had a view over the farmyards inland, the vague outline of Nordenbro beyond, and still further, possibly as far as the dairy, she could see the fire. Merely the flame of a candle from this distance. Spinning on her heel, she charged back down the hill. The slippery stones cut her feet. Back in the kitchen, her father was now seated on a stool. Her mother was at the stove, heating the blue coffee pot. Fire at Nordenbro! Marie yelled, bursting through the door. Her father jumped to his feet, toppling the stool in the process. Her mother lifted a coffee cup from a nail on the wall. Sit down, Carl, she said, in a tone that was usually reserved for Kai. Finish your coffee, and I'll make you a couple of sandwiches. Then you go over there and see if your help is needed. Marie's father picked up the stool and sat down again. May I come along, father? Marie asked. Her father waved her over, patted his knee for her to sit. Satan also brought along his little children, I suppose. Marie's mother sighed and poked the fire in the hearth. Her body had the form of the women in the painting, Marie noted. The ankle-length, dark dress that her mother wore disguised her belly when her back was turned. Marie wondered whether the potato pickers also carried babies in their bellies, if their breathing was just as labored as her mother's when they straightened their backs. Did these women groan and drop into a chair with a sigh when they were done, stretching out their legs out before their in unladylike way that her mother did? Why is this so much heavier than the others? Her mother groaned. Its devil horns are weighing you down, her father said. Are you going to make those sandwiches? Marie's mother got to her feet to butter their bread. Marie lit the tallow candle again and went upstairs. She changed into her day clothes, laying her rough nightdress and her bonnet in her drawer. She put on her newly darned socks, blew out the candle, and crept back down the stairs in the dark. Her father was waiting outside for her. He was so tall that she always felt as if she were a dog walking beside him. Marie struck her feet into her clogs and left without a backward glance at her mother leaning on the kitchen table, panting. Can we talk about the significance of the fire a little bit? Like, I think it ties up really well to the ecological.
Yeah. Yeah, it does. Well, the thing is that the houses on the countryside are thatched with reed, and the father is a thatcher, and he doesn't have any work. So very usual when there's a thunder, the thatched roofs will catch fire. So he has been wishing for one of the roofs to catch fire, so he could get some work. And so one of the roofs does catch fire, and then he feels like he's the devil himself because he has made a bad wish for something very bad to happen. So he feels guilty and mortified, and that's why he said, "Oh, my children are the devil's children, and they have horns inside your belly," to the mother, and so
I think this is also what. Sorry, go ahead.
No.
Just say. When you speak of individual ideas in the context of larger tragedies, right? And this is that thin line between what is selfish and when you're not left with a choice, and just plain survival, right?
Yeah.
And you can't like, these are all very such interconnected concepts that you can't paint someone in black and white, or as, even though the father is violent, entitled, but also in that entire context, you kind of understand. Your heart goes out to him as well.
Life is really hard on him because, and that's, I mean, I write a lot about the women's story, but I think also the men is important because the gender roles are really hard also on him, because he's the provider. He's expected to provide for his family, and he has no work. So it's really difficult for him, and he gets aggressive and violent, but he tries, and he tries all he can. And maybe if life was easy on him, more easy, if he had work, then he would be less violent. So I mean, it's not simple, and he I hope during the book that he is shown as a complex a complex person, because I think everybody is complex. Nobody is just violent or just sweet. We all have all things inside of us, and then life can bring you in a situation where you just don't have any capacity to be kind. And he is all, I mean, he tries to be kind to the children. He brings Marie along to the fire. So what happens is, in practice, it's a natural fire. It's a thunder, the lightning that sets the roof on fire. And when that happens, because the thing is, we still did it when I was a child, but we lived in a suburban area. There were no thatched houses, there were no fires, but still my parents, if there was a thunderstorm, we would stay up all night and drink thunder coffee to stay awake, because you had to be alert. Because if one house catched fire, everybody would come. So you knew that the whole community would come and help.
But is that a baggage your parents had from their own context, or was that a real possibility in the suburbs as well?
No, and in the suburbs, if there had been a fire, you would call the fire brigade.
Right.
But here there was no fire brigade. There was just the people.
But you stayed up too, even though you knew that this is.
Yeah, and still, if I hear thunder, I'm like, can we sleep or should we stay awake? And the funny thing is, I moved to the countryside. I lived in Copenhagen for many years, and I moved to the countryside. And now around me, I have thatched houses. So I'm like, And some
What
of
a
them are
full
summer
circle.
houses, so I feel like I have the responsibility to look out for the fire. So it's really deep rooted. Yeah, and also it's part of a culture to make these houses, to make these roofs. They are not everywhere in the world, so it's a very special kind. But my grandfather in his real life was a thatcher, and he fell down the roof and broke his back with 8 children at home. And it happens also to the father in the book. And so the thing is, we hear in the beginning, he's a member of the Social Democratic Party, and that was almost communists in the 30s. They were very red. And so he keeps it also hidden, his party book. You're not showing it to everybody. But when he broke his back and he went to hospital for almost half a year, my grandmother, along with 8 children, would receive some social security, very little money, but enough to survive. They did survive, but what happened is that because they got social security, they took away their voting right. So if you had, I don't know how, I think somewhere still it's like that, but in these times, if you got money from the state, you were not allowed to vote. And for my grandfather, it was just the most terrible thing that could happen to him, is that you took away his capacity to be part of the democratic process. And he suffered severely mentally for not being able to provide for his family and for having taken away his vote to right.
It's like all the agency stripped off an identity altogether, and that is rather tragic.
Yeah, because even though you're poor, you have a pride that you can go and you can vote for somebody you believe in, and that's
and you feel like you have some amount of control in the future.
I don't know if you have rules about things similar in India.
Oh, we have no social security
of age can vote. Yeah.
See you.
Okay, thank you so much. Thank you everybody who joined. Thank you.